in my attempt to do some proper investigative journalism, I looked on your LinkedIn profile, and I saw you had a diploma in music grade 8.
Yes.
And whenever I see something about music, I have to ask about it because I did a lot of it myself and thought I was going to be a professional musician for a while.
Okay.
So maybe what did you get your diploma in, and maybe what is the grade 8 system for people outside of the UK and Ireland, I guess?
Okay, so that's a great question, and this is bringing back memories because I haven't played piano in quite a number of years. So in Ireland, we have a grading system where you do 2 years with a teacher, elementary and preliminary, and then you start going on to grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. once you've done those 2 kind of first years. Once you start moving on to grades, then you have to be assessed at the end of the year by a external examiner. And so, you have your piano teacher. In my case, I would go to her house. Some people have it in like a little business, but in my case, I was going to the piano teacher's house, and we would spend about an hour practicing. She also had other trainees, and then I would get homework to do at home. And for the first year or 2, we didn't have a piano at home, and so my parents didn't want to buy one until they knew I was invested in playing piano. So that was kind of difficult, but the first 2 years are quite easy, and so I managed without a piano at home. And so I got...
Sorry, not to criticize your parents, but how exactly do they imagine you get into piano without having a piano?
I'm not sure. I suppose they felt that, an hour a week was enough for Gillian to, get some basic skills in piano lessons. That's how they felt about it. Now, they are the ones who put me into piano playing in the first place. They love the idea of, having a daughter who could do a party piece or, be at events or weddings or whatever and be the one who's entertaining, let's say. Personally, I liked piano. I didn't love it, I have to be quite honest. I was doing it initially because that's what my parents wanted me to do. Anyway, got the piano, started on, grade 1, 2, 3, etc. And I did it for about 8 years in total. And I think when I stopped was when things got very busy at university. So I initially started at kind of high school or secondary school. I'm not sure what the equivalent is in Germany, but I probably was about 14 or 15 when I had started. And then, as I got into about the second or third year of university, it became very difficult to keep up piano and do a quite demanding curriculum at university. I was studying psychology, and then I also had a kind of small part-time job. So that's when I gave up piano. And after I gave up piano, I really didn't play very often after that. And my partner, his youngest brother, is almost a professional musician, playing piano and violin. And so sometimes when I'm at their house, there's a piano and I occasionally play just to reinvigorate that side of myself. But no, I certainly don't, I guess, practice often, and I probably don't use it in my general life. But I'm sure it was good for development and things like that. I would recommend it to parents out there if they want to get their children into other things. I do think music is a very good way to kind of ignite children's interest in other things beyond, sports and what kids are doing at school.
What you like to play when I'm asking just because, and for those not interested in the piano and music, I'll keep this relatively brief. But piano was my kind of main instrument. I also started pretty late, but then really kind of fell into it almost. And I'm curious, like, what do you like to play now when you see that piano occasionally?
So when I was training, I was given specific pieces to do that I would be assessed on. So I never really got to learn all of the party pieces, etc. So what I play when I play now is, say, for example, if I was at my partner's house where there's a piano, I would play whatever is in their piano books. So I can read music and I will play that basically. And so when I play now, it's more about me trying to remember exactly what the notes are and, remember the aspects of how you read music as opposed to doing it for fun. I think Beethoven was probably some of my favorite kind of pieces that I played as a kid. But I wouldn't say that I have a specific genre of music that I love to play. Do you?
Yeah. I think in a sense, like what so it was classical piano. I never played any jazz or improvisation, anything like that. But I guess in a sense, I think I like pretty much the standard kind of piano repertoire you might have. I don't have any particular unusual things. Like, played a lot of Bach, played a lot of like Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Debussy, that kind of stuff. I didn't really like Mozart and the kind of first Viennese classical music that much, but yeah, kind of the stuff you might see at a concert, basically. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to me that in a way it seems like you kind of diligently did what you had to do almost.
Oh yeah.
Whereas for me, it was just like it was funny to me when you said like I had these pieces I had to do. I was like, that's not me. Like I would if my teacher would suggest something, or like I'd really try hard to play something else. In Germany, we don't really have these kind of like grading system as you have in the UK. So I think if I'd been in the UK, I might have had to do more of that. But here it was just private tuition, and I was like, no, I'm playing this.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't have lasted long with my piano teacher, I don't think. But, I think that's a better way to be. Because playing what you want is important, especially when you're young, and you're kind of trying to follow your own interests. Not that it's important to be diligent, of course, as well. But I do think there's something to be said for following what you like. So kudos to you. Yeah,
and it obviously works a lot better if you're so into it that I actually practice for hours every day.
Oh, okay. Well, exactly.
So it's like it's not like I want to play a piece and then, not practice it. But, but yeah. Anyway, we wanted to talk about dementia.
Yeah, dementia.
And spatial navigation. Yeah, I'm curious, kind of basically just start off, like, how did you get into that topic? I saw you had a bachelor's and master's in psychology in Ireland, and then somehow you ended up in Norwich. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I guess it was in 2014 that I graduated from clinical psychology, and I had done kind of a master's in clinical psychology at Trinity College Dublin. And in Ireland, the typical route for psychology graduates was to either go specialize in something else, like occupational health, or go do medicine or something like that, or go do applied clinical psychology, work in practice. And you could go down a counseling route or a clinical psychology route. So they're both slightly different. And so I had done a bit of research throughout my undergrad and my master's, and I really loved it. But there wasn't a traditional route for research in Ireland. So I kind of was like, well, maybe this isn't a realistic kind of career avenue for me. And so I went, after I had graduated my master's, to work in a secondary mental health clinic to get experience as a clinical psychologist. And so I stayed...
So secondary mental health clinic? What does that mean?
People who generally don't get better at primary health services. So when they first look for mental health services, if they are not getting better with what they're first offered, they're usually moved on to secondary mental health services. So generally they'd be kind of seen as like a more, they would have a more severe condition, or they have something that's treatment resistant. And so when I was there, it was a very meaningful experience in that I think I matured a lot. But I felt that this doesn't bring me meaning in life. I didn't feel that I was making a huge difference there. I did find it challenging, and it's good to find things challenging. But I just didn't feel that it was really what I was supposed to do. So a friend of mine who had also done her master's at Trinity, and so we were friends because we studied together basically, she had gone to the University of Cambridge to do research. And so we would keep in touch, and she was like, hey, look, we're looking for another research assistant here. Would you be interested? And I said yes. And so I had an interview with 2 people. They were like, great, come on over. And so then I moved from Ireland to England, and I started working as a research assistant at the University of Cambridge. I knew straight away that this is kind of more what I'm supposed to do. I just felt that I had a very easy transition to that. I also had friends that were there who were Irish, and I made new friends. And so I was very happy with the decision I had made. But then I had another decision to make, because to stay in research, you need to do a PhD. And so I hadn't really planned out whether or not I wanted to do a PhD when I had initially moved to England. And so, you know, I had a lot of friends in Cambridge at this point. And so they were like, you really should just start looking straight away. As you know, you like your research. A lot of my friends had already started PhDs in Cambridge. And so I said, okay, I'll start looking. And so when I started looking, I had just missed the deadline to apply in Cambridge. And so I was looking all over the UK. And that's when I saw a PhD position advertised at Michael Hornberger's lab. And Michael had actually been he was originally in Australia. Then he had come to Cambridge with his wife and two kids, and he worked there for a while. And then the University of Anglia, or Norwich Medical School, had offered him a professorship and a fantastic, opportunity to open a lab there. So he had gone there. I didn't know him at this point. Like, I didn't know Michael in Cambridge when I was there. But when I saw he was looking for a PhD student in Norwich Medical School, I was really interested in his area of research. So specifically, he was interested in preclinical stages of Alzheimer's disease, detecting Alzheimer's disease kind of at that asymptomatic stage, using very sophisticated cognitive tests. And what also appealed to me is he had a collaboration with a basically research dietitian who was interested in whether or not omega-3s could help people age well. And I was also interested in kind of the whole concept around aging well. That's always something I've been interested in. And so that really sold me. So I applied for the position. I had also applied for another position in London. I did the two interviews more or less at the same time. And in Norwich, they just said, look, we'll give you all of the funding. We're very happy for you to come. I had spoken to Michael over the phone, and he just seemed like the person I was kind of looking for, I guess, in a mentor. And in London, they were a little bit more like, oh, we're not sure if funding can be secured or not. It wasn't 100%. So I felt it was safer to go with my Norwich offer. And so I then moved basically to Norwich. Now I still had a partner in Cambridge, and so every second week I would commute to Cambridge, and every second week he would commute to Norwich, and that's how we kind of did it. But I think it was a great decision. I really think my PhD was a fantastic experience professionally and personally, and so I'm really basically happy with the decision I made there. And sometimes I used to think, oh, would it have been nice to live in London? But when you're doing your PhD, things can be quite busy for you. I don't know what your experience with PhD was, but it certainly can get very busy at certain times of the year. And, I think being somewhere like Norwich, where there's lots of nature, it's a lovely kind of town or small city. And it's also close to London and Cambridge if you want to get away. That was very advantageous. London is great, but London is also, there's a lot of sensory information coming at you when you're in London. And I just wonder, would that have been the best environment when you're also trying to get a lot of work done and stay calm in stressful situations that sometimes come, etc. So yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up doing a PhD in Norwich.
You mentioned that Michael was kind of what you were looking for in a mentor at the time. What were you looking for, and kind of what makes a good mentor, or how do you select the right one? Because it also sounds like you didn't spend a huge amount of time with Michael before.
No, I hadn't. Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I suppose selecting the right mentor is something that has changed for me as I've developed, right? So what I need in a mentor now might necessarily been what I needed back then, or it might be what I need in a few years, because even when you're opening your own lab, you still kind of have mentors. That's kind of how it works in academia, right? So I think particularly then, when I had graduated my undergrad degree, and I was very lucky in my undergrad, I'd done research and I actually was able to publish my undergrad thesis. I had a really supportive mentor there. who was also German. So I just need to collect German mentors. But he said to me, be very careful who you choose as your mentor. He said, you can be quite sensitive. That really struck me at the time. I was like, gosh, what does he mean by that? And I knew I kind of can be a sensitive person, but I was like, I didn't even think he had noticed that. And so when I was talking to Michael initially about doing the PhD with him, something slightly reminded me of, something in Michael reminded me of my previous undergrad mentor. And Michael also seemed quite upbeat. Sometimes in science, you can get a lot of people who are very serious, which can be okay. But for me, I knew it was important to have someone who is kind of upbeat, who wouldn't get too cross about things, for example, if something wasn't going right. He seemed interested in training people. He was quite advanced himself. So I knew he had climbed already to a certain level, which meant that if he was already at a certain level, he'd be interested in helping kind of other trainees get up that ladder, if you know what I mean. So that was another plus. And I suppose a lot of it was intuition too. You know, I kind of just felt, oh yeah, this is someone who I can chat with. This is someone I can ask for help if I need help. And so that's why I think I knew that it would be a good fit.
Okay. Just before I forget it, I mean, I have a whole interview with Michael for people interested, and there will be a fair amount of overlap, which I guess what I talked about with him and what we'll talk about now later. I mean, if I remember correctly, what you said you were going to do and what you ended up doing, was that exactly the same thing? Because it sounds to me then, I mean, with Michael, there was, I guess around that time, he was doing the Sea Hero Quest game. And I think that completely changed what he was doing. Yeah. Again, I mean, I talked to Michael and Hugo Spears at length about Sea Hero Quest, but maybe briefly, what is Sea Hero Quest? And yeah, how did you get involved with it?
So I did end up doing kind of what I had came to do, but Sea Hero Quest became a major part of what I was doing. And initially, it wasn't a major part. I don't think it was even in the kind of proposal for my PhD project. But anyway, so when I arrived, they had just finished collecting the benchmark population data from Sea Hero Quest. And the way they did that then is they created a kind of online game, or you could use it on a phone or an iPad. And it's basically able to record how well people navigate space or solve orientation tasks. And so what they initially wanted to do with this game was be able to record how people navigate in kind of a open arena or an open environment, or how well they remember certain spatial landmarks and that kind of thing. They wanted to record that information. And then they also recorded information from the players on, you know, what age they are, where they grew up, what their nationality was, kind of basic demographic information, I guess that's what you call it. The initial aim, at least I think, for Sea Hero Quest was just to kind of understand how do humans navigate, because we have a lot of information on, you know, human memory, how we remember things. People have been studying memory for a very long time, but spatial navigation and how we orientate space was a little less well understood, and there wasn't any kind of normative benchmarks on how people navigate. Do men and women differ on how they navigate? There's kind of a stereotype that there is a difference between men and women, but is that true or not? We didn't know. And all of these kind of things become important when you think about potentially using a spatial navigation task in a medical setting. So if demographic factors influence how people perform, then you need to take that into account when you're trying to potentially diagnose someone with spatial disorientation. So
Sorry, just to briefly interrupt, just so we don't forget it. For people who don't know, this wasn't like a small task. This was, I mean, the task is relatively straightforward, but it's basically as a game that people like playing, and they got, 2.5 million people or something to play.
Yeah, I think it's more like 4 million Yeah.
Is it 4 million? Yeah, but it's basically just to kind of put in context when we say we have some demographic areas like of a lot of people. So
Sorry, this is
it's
big
like conceptually
data.
very different from like a typical study you might run online or something like that. Yeah. Sorry.
And so if people want to know more about the origins of the game, they should listen to Hugo and Michael's discussion, because I'm sure it would be more informative than my own. I wasn't around for the development. I just kind of used the data when it came in. But it was very successful in that it became available on the App Store and the Play Store, and it was downloaded by more than 4 million people, and we were able to collect data on a large proportion of those people. Anyone who downloaded the game had to consent to their data being used by scientists. So some people could have downloaded it, for example, and just said, no, I'm not interested in the science. I just want to play it for, like they play Candy Crush or something like that. And so, that's just another thing, another aspect of it, I guess. But I used to give it to my participants in my PhD study, which we might talk about later. And one thing that always struck me is how visually stimulating the game was. So I think that's really what made it so successful. Was the game itself was very like even just the having it on your phone, it felt like an immersive experience. There was something very visually appealing about the game. And it also felt like a game that you kind of pay for, if you know what I mean. It was just that level of good. And
it wasn't like an experiment you do by scientists that just looks like someone coded it in 3 weeks.
Yes, that is exactly it. Like those MATLAB kind of or visualizations or Psych Toolbox. Yeah, so it was very sophisticated. I think there's another program called Unity Game or something that Michael used to talk about that can make something similar, but to see HeroQuest. But they had actually hired a gaming company, I think it was Glitchers Inc. in London, to do this game for them. So, they really had experts basically working on this. And as you probably know, it was also sponsored and financed by Deutsche Telekom. And so Deutsche Telekom were interested in doing something for science. And they had kind of asked Michael, we're interested in giving money for something that, can do good. And so that's how Michael and Hugo ended up kind of developing the game.
Yeah. So how did you end up using it for Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so I suppose Michael was always a dementia researcher. And so when he had initially pitched to understand how people navigate space in the normal population, which we were learning with Sea Hero Quest, he had wanted to know that so that it could help him inform how we best develop tests to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. So how do we make them sensitive and personalized? Do we need to make these tests like of spatial navigation personalized to the individual based on their gender, their age, etc.? And so this is kind of a question that my PhD then sought to answer is, can we use the information we've collected from the global population on navigation ability to make a more sensitive cognitive test for Alzheimer's disease? And so I suppose just to go, I think you mentioned you want to discuss the review and the PNS paper. So what we first did is we just decided to write a review on spatial navigation in Alzheimer's disease. And so some people had worked in this, in that some people had looked at spatial navigation in people with mild cognitive impairment, people with dementia, people who were already clinically diagnosed. But very little to no work had been done on spatial navigation tools in a preclinical population. So preclinical is just defined as people who have kind of Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brain, but they don't have any cognitive symptoms. They're going about their daily life well, they're functioning well. They might have some degree of subjective cognitive decline, but not enough to warrant a clinical diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. And that diagnosis comes before a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease dementia.
So brief question here. This also relates to kind of the whole, I guess the whole point of developing these early diagnostics is to find the people who don't have full-blown Alzheimer's when it's too late. So I'm curious, how do you, for example, how is dementia usually diagnosed? And in the case of people who are preclinical, how do you find someone with neural, pre-stages, let's say, of Alzheimer's without them really having any behavioral or cognitive problems? How do you find those people?
Yeah, so that's what most of the Alzheimer's disease field are working on at the moment. And so I guess how we find them is we look at biomarkers. So what we do is if someone suspects that they might be having some cognitive issues and they're concerned about dementia and Alzheimer's disease, they'll come into a memory clinic. And what we can do there is we can measure Alzheimer's disease in the CSF. So we know that Alzheimer's disease is caused by two neurotoxic proteins, or the deposition of these proteins in the brain. One is beta-amyloid and the other is neurotoxic tau, right? So we have these amyloid and tau proteins that we know cause Alzheimer's disease. And so we can take a sample from the CSF and measure them there. If we do that, it can be a little bit invasive. So taking a lumbar puncture to get a CSF sample can cause headaches. In the worst case, you can get infections and things as a result of it, which is not that common, but it happens. So it comes with a certain degree of risk, and generally people don't like getting lumbar punctures. So the next option is, a positron emission tomography scan, which is quite expensive brain scan, and we need to inject contrast into the individual. So what that contrast do is, so it's injected, you have two different contrasts for amyloid beta and tau, and that contrast kind of moves into the brain and it binds to that neurotoxic protein that's depositing, right? And once it binds, we can image that on MRI. These scans are really, really valuable because what we can then do is look, not only does the person have Alzheimer's disease, but exactly where is it? Because that's also important for diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, where are these neurotoxic proteins depositing in the brain? So that's the second way, but that's expensive. And it's usually not part of the healthcare coverage that people have in different countries. So, it's not your standard assessment. And so if you wanted to get something like a positron emission tomography first scan, you'd firstly have to find a hospital that's willing to do it or who does it as standard. And then you'd probably have to pay quite a bit to get that done, unless you're doing it for research. But if you're doing it for research, you don't get your results. So, and so in the past 5 years, blood-based biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease have come online and they've really transformed the field. Now, they haven't really made it into clinical practice yet because there's many different assays that are used to measure how much Alzheimer's disease we have in the blood. And we're still working on creating cutoffs for what's abnormal and what's not abnormal. And those cutoffs will vary depending on the type of assay and the machine you're using to measure Alzheimer's disease in the blood. So that field in blood-based biomarkers is rapidly progressing and developing, but we're not at the place where we can roll it out to the GP, for example. It's just not there yet. But I expect it will be maybe in the next 5 to 10 years at least. And so what blood-based biomarkers do, so far, they're very good at measuring levels of beta-amyloid in the brain. So we know that if we measure Alzheimer's disease in the blood, what we're seeing is that it correlates very well with beta-amyloid as measured with a PET scan. So that more expensive measure I kind of mentioned just previously. What it doesn't do, though, is a blood-based biomarker doesn't correlate so well with levels of tau as measured with PET scans. So the blood-based biomarkers seem to be a good proxy for how much beta-amyloid an individual has. But it's not as good a proxy for how much tau an individual has. Is that a problem or is it not? I don't think there's a firm consensus around if that's a problem or not. But just to contextualize this a bit more, as we age, we all deposit a certain amount of beta-amyloid. It's not that uncommon for you to start accumulating amyloid in your 70s, for example. It is a bit more abnormal to start accumulating amyloid in your 50s, So the time you accumulate can be important. But anyway, suffice to say, the real thing that seems to be problematic for cognition is when we deposit tau as well. So we have a certain level of beta amyloid. Usually we can measure that first. We can see that coming online first with a scan, for example, and then we get tau. Now, when we can see a significant amount of tau depositing in the medial temporal lobe, so usually it's first found in the entorhinal cortex, we find it hard to measure in the hippocampus, but in the medial temporal kind of area, and then it kind of projects up into kind of more parietal regions. And so that's the typical course of spread. And so when we see tau in the medial temporal lobe, and when that tau starts to move outside the medial temporal lobe, is when people are super vulnerable to cognitive decline. So they'll usually, go down a slope very quickly once tau is in these areas of the brain. And so when we're measuring amyloid with a kind of a blood sample, it's still very informative kind of in that, okay, so if we see people are having abnormal levels of beta amyloid, that's important. We know they're at risk. But if we don't know what their levels of tau are, it's kind of, I suppose, a slightly missing piece. And so I think what people who are developing these blood-based biomarkers are trying to do is see if we can get a biomarker for tau as well. And so that will be important, because then we can look at both levels of beta amyloid and tau in the blood and make inferences about what we think is happening in the brain. So at the moment, as I said, we can really only make inferences around how much beta amyloid is kind of in the brain.
You've kind of already, I wanted to ask kind of what the differences are between beta and tau, and you explained some of it, but I think it might be useful to go into a little bit more detail. For example, I'm assuming from what you said that they, for example, don't really correlate with each other, or not particularly highly. But I'm curious, like, what are the, in the context of dementia and Alzheimer's, like, kind of what are the differentiating factors between the two?
Between beta amyloid and tau?
Or maybe also for spatial navigation. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So what's the difference? So they do correlate. They just don't have amazing, there's not like a one-to-one correlation, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. As many people might know, some people can deposit amyloid to, a significant amount of amyloid. And they can also deposit a significant amount of tau and never get symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, right? We call these people resistant to the implications of having this disease in their brain. And so there's a lot of people studying that. I work with people studying that to try and understand what is it about these people that help them to stay cognitively well despite these deposits. And so that's really important to understand, because that can inform treatment, obviously. Some people deposit beta amyloid, but it takes them a long time to get kind of deposit tau. And if they don't deposit tau, then, they're not so at risk for cognitive decline. And so that's another interesting piece is, okay, so some people are resistant to tau, but not so much amyloid. And so what's happening there? But in the general course of Alzheimer's disease, if you have a very typical patient, you will see a correlation between amyloid and tau, such that amyloid accumulates, it spreads, and then you get accumulation of tau in the medial temporal lobe, and then amyloid hits a threshold where it kind of stays at the same level across the brain, but tau rapidly increases. And so as tau increases, then your cognition declines. And so amyloid is interesting because when it goes up, when amyloid starts depositing or increasing in the brain, it kind of increases everywhere. It doesn't follow a very typical spatial pattern like tau does. Like tau is very specific kind of and where it spreads, but amyloid is a bit more kind of spread. And so I guess that's why people might also say that the correlation between these two proteins isn't so high, because where they're actually moving in the brain and when they're moving in the brain is not really the same, or is not characterized the same way for both these proteins. But if you look at the typical course of Alzheimer's disease, you will see a correlation such that once you hit a significant threshold of amyloid, you get a very significant increase in tau as well.
maybe I want to ask a little bit about kind of why spatial navigation is particularly relevant for Alzheimer's. And maybe you could link that to why the entorhinal cortex and tau is a particularly relevant area.
So why spatial navigation? Typically, we use memory tests in the clinic to diagnose someone with, probable Alzheimer's disease or probable mild cognitive impairment. So the problems with memory tests are that memory typically declines in normal aging. So even if our brain is aging at a kind of typical pace, we're still getting a decline in our memory performance. And so that's one issue. How do we differentiate between what's normal aging and what's a very early stage of Alzheimer's disease? When people come to memory clinics where we typically, kind of diagnose dementias and things, they come saying, my memory has declined. I'm having problems with my memory, right? They never really talk about orientation and how well they're doing there. And so what orientation then allows us to do is kind of, we can assess it in the lab, and we could see, well, how well are people doing on their spatial orientation? Because typically people's spatial orientation, some would say, might not be as vulnerable to the normal aging process as episodic memory is, which is our gold standard test for Alzheimer's disease that we typically use. The other issue with memory is it's very much kind of sensitive to someone's education level. So how, sophisticated their level of education is will partly determine how well or how good their memory is in later life. That's less the case for spatial navigation. So your educational attainment typically doesn't predict how well you orientate space. And so we typically, if we were to use spatial navigation tasks in the memory clinic, then we'd have to worry slightly less about something like socioeconomic status or education, kind of muddying the waters on your assessment. And then the final thing is that it doesn't rely on speaking a certain language. Spatial orientation doesn't rely on speaking a certain language or being from a certain country or anything like that, like many memory tests do. They're kind of designed for English-speaking languages, or maybe they're validated in Spanish, but maybe they're not, etc. With spatial orientation tasks, it really doesn't matter, how fluent you are in a certain language or whether or not you have the language at all, as long as you could read one or two questions or the translator is there to translate one or two questions. And so it's very advantageous for that reason. So if you think of low and middle income countries in particular, you can see that spatial orientation tasks would have a lot of utility there, because it's very difficult to use memory tests in illiterate populations or populations who just don't have English. Now, the issue with spatial navigation is that it's not yet understood how well it correlates with Alzheimer's disease in the brain. So I've done a little bit of work on this. So initially in my PhD, we looked at people who are genetically at risk for Alzheimer's disease, who are likely to have Alzheimer's disease in the brain. And so these people who are genetically at risk were performing slightly more poorly on C-Hero Quest, but also other spatial navigation tasks. And I just did a really big study in, I think it was 3,000 people who are part of a European Alzheimer's disease registrar. And we looked at how their spatial navigation performance correlates with levels of amyloid and tau in the CSF. So we took, the study team took lumbar punctures, we measured Alzheimer's disease, and we correlated with spatial navigation tasks. And unfortunately, we didn't see a terribly strong association here. So I think there's two things that could be happening here. Our spatial navigation tasks that we use in that particular study were not as sophisticated as some of our other tasks that require a little bit more learning or a little bit more kind of work with the participant, or that these particular tasks we have are correlating well with something to do with Alzheimer's disease. Maybe it could be neuroinflammation, maybe it could be, some other pathological change that happens in kind of genetically at-risk people. But for some reason, they're just not capturing amyloid and tau at that very early stage. And so we're still working on this, basically. We're still working on really understanding how well spatial navigation does track biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. And this is really important for translating spatial navigation tasks to the clinic. Because if we know that they don't correlate very well with the biomarkers, then that's a problem. But there's a lot of people working on this. It's not just me, or it's just not just Michael's lab. I mean, there's a lot of people, particularly in Germany, actually, who are working on this and understanding if we can make slightly more sensitive or specific kind of spatial navigation tasks that can track levels of beta-amyloid and tau, but it's sort of an evolving field. And the reason we're interested in using cognitive tasks like this is just that they're very easy and inexpensive. So we can screen thousands and thousands of people for preclinical Alzheimer's disease using cognitive tests at not a huge cost and not a huge effort. If you wanted to use a PET scan, you'd be, we're talking huge cost here, which isn't realistic for most countries. Lumbar punctures, as I said, have their own issues. Blood tests are much more promising, but we still haven't a fully validated blood test with an abnormal cutoff that can be used in the clinic. And so that's why people are still working on kind of developing cognitive tests to sort of track the disease process.
I guess interesting. From what you just described, it seems to me, if I understood you correctly, that kind of the aim really is to have a cheaper alternative for the traditional biomarkers, the more expensive ones. Mm-hmm. My initial assumption actually was kind of that it was supposed to be also somewhat complementary to it. So, I guess you can have different, some are complementary, some just measures the same thing quicker and cheaper. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, how complementary are the spatial navigation tasks, or do they pretty much just tell you what the biomarkers tell you at a cheaper cost?
And that's a great point. So there was kind of a discussion about this among the people who usually set out the diagnostic criteria for Alzheimer's and dementia, like how important are cognitive tests now? And so they concluded that cognitive tests are still very important, because we have these people who are sometimes resistant to amyloid and tau, such that they don't experience cognitive decline or cognitive changes, right? And so even if we just had the biomarker alone, so if we know, okay, this person has high amyloid or this person has high amyloid and tau, if that is not translating at all to a poor performance on a cognitive task, even if it's subtle, even if it's a subtly poor score, then we have to question, is this really Alzheimer's disease? Because we know really what Alzheimer's disease is: someone who is, has a poor short-term memory, has a poor spatial disorientation, is prone to getting lost, and in the later stages has difficulty recognizing family members and might have hallucinations, etc. So if an individual who we think is preclinical Alzheimer's disease and has high beta biomarkers, or who has high levels of the disease in the brain, is not showing any decrement in cognitive performance, then we have to question, is our diagnosis correct? And does this person just need to be tracked for a lot longer, basically? So cognitive tests are still important for that reason, as you said, as a complementary to biomarkers. But certainly I would say the Alzheimer's disease field probably put more emphasis on biomarkers now. Like, they want to understand, is that disease in the brain or not? Cognitive tests are still important, but a lot of the Alzheimer's disease research these days is focused on developing biomarkers or getting biomarkers translated into clinic.
Mm-hmm. In a sense, last question or last topic kind of about spatial navigation and dementia. What's the role of menopause in spatial navigation? So I hadn't really heard anything about this until I saw that you had a few articles on this.
Yeah. So
and maybe what exactly is menopause?
Menopause. Yeah. So menopause is something that happens for every woman, right? And it usually happens at the age of 51. And so what happens is levels of estrogen decline, levels of follicle stimulating hormone go up, and that leads to a very different hormonal situation for that woman, and that induces menopause. So menopause is when a woman is no longer able to have children, for example, once they're going through menopause. Now, menopause also can cause a lot of fairly undesirable symptoms for a woman. So difficulty sleeping, mood swings, depression, hot flashes are a very common one. It can interrupt daily living. It can interrupt performance at work. It can have issues, and it can last typically for up to 7 years in some women. So that's quite a long time. And what we've seen in our data, at least, is that it's not just the menopause transition that seems to put women at risk of dementia, because women are more vulnerable to Alzheimer's dementia than men. Just based on epidemiological studies, we can see that women seem to get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease more than men do. Some people say that's survival bias because women live longer. Some people say it's not. But generally speaking, what we've seen is that women, if women move into a menopause earlier than an average woman, so if they have a premature or early menopause, they are more at risk of Alzheimer's disease, dementia in later life. Is this something to do with the fact that their hormones are declining earlier? We're working on understanding if that's the case. Or is it just that the early menopause is a marker of accelerated aging in general? And it's not necessarily the early menopause, but it's just that they're aging quicker for some reason. And then they're therefore more at risk of age-related diseases, right? Like dementia, it could be that too. And so this is actually a topic that's really only opened up again in the past few years. And so what we did in our recent study is that we actually looked at how women with early menopause are kind of doing in terms of their biomarkers about 15 or 17 years after they had their early menopause or their premature menopause. And we saw that the women with the early and premature menopause are showing higher levels of that bad tau we were talking about. So that neurotoxic tau protein that we know is particularly important for cognitive decline. And we measured this on a PET scan as well. So there does seem to be a link between early and premature menopause and greater risk of Alzheimer's disease, dementia in later life. And so if hormones are the cause of that, we're not sure, like if early hormonal fluctuations are the cause of that, or if it's something else. But hormones do play a big role in brain health and brain function. I mean, that's very basic kind of science, and that has been looked at in rodents and in humans. So hormones could be the link here, but they also might not be. And so this is something we're kind of investigating. And we're also looking at what are the implications of using hormone therapy. So prescribing women hormones, how does that change this relationship between early menopause and Alzheimer's disease, dementia? And Alzheimer's disease is a very prominent disease in women, but it's less prominent in men. So, up to 2/3 of our whole AD population are women, and one third is men. And so there's definitely some sex divergence here. So there must be some factors in women that are putting them at a higher risk of developing this disease. And that's why we're looking at menopause. Now, there are other things that we could look at. And another interesting thing sorry if this is a bit off topic, but we know that Parkinson's disease is much more common in men. So about 70% of men, right, have Parkinson's disease, and about 30% of women have Parkinson's disease in that PD population.
Okay, yeah. I was saying not 70% of all men.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so, sorry, that would be very rough for the general population, but I think that's really interesting. Like, we really don't understand why that is either. Why is Parkinson's disease so much more common in men? Parkinson's disease typically onsets earlier than Alzheimer's disease does. What does that mean? And Alzheimer's disease is theorized to start in the gut. Could that give us some clues why men are more at risk? I think these are really interesting questions, and they're not really understood at the moment. So this is what I'm working on at the moment.
It's good to have a topic where you'll have what's it called, career. What's the word? Basically, you can spend a while on this topic.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
It's maybe not so nice for the clinical population, but it's nice as a scientist, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, hopefully it will translate to treatment, right? Because then the other question, I guess, is if there's really stark differences in how women get to Alzheimer's disease versus how men get to Alzheimer's disease, does that then mean that we should be using more personalized approaches based on sex? And so I think that this is something that's really interesting, and it's really important to understand.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so at the end of each episode now, recurring questions. The first is kind of, what is a book or paper that you think more people should read? This can be, something you discovered in an archive somewhere no one else has ever heard of. It can be a famous article that lots of people know and they should read again. Do you have anything?
Yeah, so it's hard I'm going to go with a book. And it's hard to pin down just one book because I think a lot of books can be very influential in our lives. But I think one that was really important for me was The Choice by Edith Eger. So she was actually in the concentration camps in World War II. And then her and her sister were there, and it documents her life during that period, how they kind of escaped that situation. And then they kind of fled to America, and she became a clinical psychologist, and now she's very famous and she helps a lot of people. And the title, The Choice, is kind of her trying to say that we can be in certain situations and we can have certain traumas and we can have very challenging environmental situations. But to a large extent, for a lot of us, at some stage, there comes a choice. Am I going to be a victim of all this, or am I going to try and take what I've learned and do something good with it? And so she kind of documents her experience with that with a lot of real life examples. And I found it really such a captivating read. And I think whenever life gets difficult, I sort of think about, her story and some other books I read as well. And I just kind of, it helps put things in context, I guess, about what's difficult and what you're just perceiving as difficult. And, life is challenging. You get thrown with a lot of things that are unexpected. And so to have stories like this that we're aware of, or that we can even just refer back to in challenging times, I think is very important for us. So that's one that's, I think, very standing out for me.
Very nice. Second question is something you wish you'd learned sooner, and maybe how you dealt with it.
So there's lots of things here, but I think I have two actually very important ones. So the first one is try not to be perfectionistic about things. This is something I learned, I think, only relatively recently, actually. But when you can embrace the noise, or you can embrace a zigzag path, you can still achieve what you want to achieve, but you can achieve it with a lot more kind of well-being and a lot more energy and a lot more kind of to give when you get there, if you know what I mean. If you just accept that the path to, or the way, or the obstacle is how it should be. Things aren't perfect, things are not terribly straightforward in life. And so I think it's very important to just accept that, everything is not going to plan, or there is going to be, some things that you didn't expect to prop up, and just being okay with that and not being too perfectionistic about certain, things related to work, but also personal life. And I think that if you do lose kind of a very high standard approach, sometimes the result ends up being the exact same. It's just that you might have a higher well-being at the end of it than if you took a very perfectionistic approach to it. And I think the other thing is kind of things aren't always as they seem. I think this is important to remember, not just at work, but for personal life too, is, things aren't always as they seem. And so being flexible again is very important, and a very important kind of way to go through life, or kind of progress up the ladder. Because if you're not flexible, or if you're not willing to accept that, you know, something you taught before was one way and it's actually another way, then that can really deter you and it can hold you back. So I think, you know, when I say things aren't always as they seem, I just mean be okay with things not being exactly as you had expected them to be, basically. And sometimes people, you know, can have a lot of difficulty, but I think with accepting that things, oh, this isn't actually how I thought it was, or this person isn't who I thought they were, or that kind of thing. But I think if you can just, you know, accept that and keep moving through life, it's very helpful. And it's a very helpful way of kind of just, you know, being happy and being able to, again, deal with any kind of setbacks you might have.
Great. And the final question is, so I just finished my PhD and we'll start a postdoc soon. Any advice? I mean, I guess your last two questions kind of maybe were already some sort of advice, but maybe for people kind of in this like early postdoc position, let's say, or maybe people who are just about to finish a PhD, any advice?
I think what I would say is just make sure that who you're working with, or the goals of the person that you're working with, align with your own goals. So usually I think things go very smoothly at work when everyone's goals align and we're looking for the same our end game is the same. I think that's important when we're moving to a postdoc or moving to a new position, is just that the people we're working with have the same, you know, goals at work as we do in terms of the same product to be produced. So that's, I think, what I would say is important when transitioning to a new kind of position.
That's a very good point. Yeah, you can avoid a lot of conflict by just knowing that both of you want the same thing anyway. That does sound like it makes things a bit easier.
Yeah, it definitely does. And, you know, sometimes, you know, you might get on very well on a personal level with someone. But if your goals don't align at work, there can be problems. And vice versa. If your goals align at work, but you don't personally get on with a person, it might not matter that much if you don't personally really like each other. If you still have the same goal that you're trying to achieve, things can just be totally fine. Like, you just go ahead and you try to achieve that. So yeah, that's why I think it's very important.
Okay, great.